The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
After more than 10 weeks of bloody battles, Russia has again referenced the nuclear option in a week of significant shifts in the war in Ukraine. Tonight, we'll get an update. Then, our Ontario Hub's report on what the parties are saying so far on the campaign trail about the opioids crisis. And from why COVID-19 doesn't affect some people to the kickoff of the 2022 Ontario election, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, May 6th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. It was a terrible, deadly week again in Ukraine as Russian forces pushed into the heavily defended steel plant in the port city of Mariupol and sent missiles as far west as Lviv. With us on where things stand now, in London, UK, Daniela Schwitzer, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundation. And in Washington, D.C., Rachel Rizzo, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
So there's a lot of news happening right now, but I wanted to start with how the West's response has changed from the beginning in February to now. This is not the quick military exercise Putin had hoped for. Daniela, where do we stand at today?
Well, the Western response was, first of all, very quick, as early as February when Russia attacked Ukraine. The European Union and our transatlantic partners were quite well prepared. This was a big contrast to what happened when Russia attacked and annexed Crimea 8 years ago. And since then, we have seen a series of sanction packages. The latest one came through just this week, a proposal by the European Commission that actually includes also an embargo on oil. It includes more banks that should be taken off SWIFT, and that includes the largest retail bank, Sberbank. And then additionally, individuals that are sanctioned. So I think the EU has shown that in the area of sanctions, it is ready to go very far. Negotiations are ongoing, whether there need to be transition periods for single member states with regards to the oil exit, but it's a big move forward. And then on the military side, a number of European countries and of course the United States and others have delivered a lot of weapons. Germany in particular has really changed policy because usually Germany would not export weapons into conflict zones, and it has done. And it decided to do so only 2 days after the war started in February. And since then, the government has moved to also exporting or allowing the exports of heavy weapons, which is a political issue in Germany. But I think the signals are very clear that the European Union again, with NATO allies and other allies of the world, really wants to help Ukraine win this war that Russia is waging.
Rachel?
I would agree with everything that Daniela says. I think what has happened over the last couple of months since Russia began its invasion is not only unity between European allies and the United States, but increasing willingness to provide assistance and weapons as time has gone on that might have not been on the table at the beginning of this, say at the end of February or in March. And so we've seen multiple rounds of sanctions. We've seen the West send, ammunition and rifles and other types of weaponry that are increasing on the scale of toughness, I would say. The United States is sending heavy weapons now, and so are some European countries. You're seeing, for example, in U.S. Congress, a supplemental spending bill of $44 billion for Ukraine. And so I think the West has shown immense unity, and that unity continues. I think the thing that worries me is that as this drags on, the longer that it goes on, I worry of that unity cracking in some way. But so far, I don't think we've seen that happen.
Well, speaking of how long this has gone on, Daniela, May 9th, this Monday, is a significant date. How come?
Well, it is a day on which Vladimir Putin would like to celebrate some kind of victory. 9th of May being the end of the war that Russia always celebrates as one of the countries that won the Second World War, and so there is a lot of anxiety at the moment that actually over the next few days that are left before Monday, that the war atrocities will increase, that there will be more bombardments and more attacks. So he can declare something. But indeed, the war will not end on that day. And, the initial expectation on the Russian side was definitely that this war could be short and quick. And so Russia could be declaring victory far more quickly than we now see. The perspectives are very bad, and that means that the war will very probably go on. And May 9th may be used by Vladimir Putin for a big speech in which he announces something, or he reframes the narrative of the war, which will then maybe mean more aggression, different ambitions than we know at the moment. And so I think that date has to be watched with a lot of caution. It also means something on the European side, because in Europe, this is also an important day, which is usually a day where one thinks of the future of Europe, of celebrating peace on our continent, and the great achievements of decades of European integration. And on this particular May 9th, a conference on the future of Europe will hand over its results to the president of the European Commission and the Parliament, and also the actual EU presidency that France holds at the moment. And the French president will hold his first Europe speech since he got re-elected, and it will be very interesting to see what the ambition level is, because Europe obviously is under pressure by that war, and at the same time has a reason to exist that hasn't quite been as strong over the past years.
Well, as you speak of the anxiety leading up to Monday, this past week on Russian primetime TV, a news anchor said Britain could be annihilated by Russian nuclear strike, one by air and one by sea, creating a tsunami that would submerge the United Kingdom and Ireland. The threat of Russia using nuclear weapons, to what extent is that a real and clear present danger? I want to hear from both of you. I'll start with you, Rachel.
So this nuclear saber rattling is something that Putin has used not just during the war in Ukraine, but he uses it as a way to threaten the West into not doing things that he doesn't want them to do, such as enlarging NATO. I think Putin he's not suicidal. I think that he's largely a rational actor. If you look at the reasons that he's laid out for this invasion, it all makes sense in his mind, as crazy as it might look to an audience in the United States or Europe or Canada. But I think he understands that the use of nuclear weapons would be crossing a threshold that hasn't been crossed in decades, and it would mean a severe and swift response on behalf of the West towards Moscow. And I don't know that, and I don't think that that's a risk that he is willing to take. The thing that I do worry about is, as the Russian military weakens, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said just a couple weeks ago that the goal is to weaken Russia to a point that they can't do the certain things that they've been doing in Ukraine. If Putin feels like his military is weakened to a point that the only option he has is the use of a, say, small tactical nuclear weapon on a Ukrainian city, just as a warning to the West to not get even further involved, then I do think that's concerning. However, I do want to be clear that I think that scenario is still highly unlikely.
Daniela, Rachel mentioned that Putin is not suicidal, but there is maybe an occasion where if he does feel in a corner, something might happen. You're there geographically closer to this. What's the sense there? Are you concerned about this happening?
Of course, it is a concern because it is, even if an unlikely scenario, it is a scenario. And I would say that much of the debate in Europe, particularly on arms deliveries, is always also seen in the context of, will that escalate the situation? Is there risk that, this would push him further to such a move? But at the same time, it is absolutely, clear that Europe has to support Ukraine in this war. So at the end of the day, the decisions made, they are for a scenario where Russia can actually win this war in Ukraine. On Putin's rationality, I think the lesson had to be learned the hard way by observers around the world, really, because when the troops build up on the eastern border of Ukraine, many said, well, it would be completely irrational for him to start fighting the war because he has so much to lose. And in military terms and economic terms, oil and gas imports to the European Union. And at the end of the day, his rationality was a different one. For him, it was the right thing to start that war and also to continue it when he realized that he wasn't getting as quickly as he wanted to where he wanted to be. And so I think today it is very hard to guess what his his calculus is and what his rationality at this stage in the war is. And again, I do think what he says on Monday has to be heard and interpreted very cautiously.
And Rachel, next to Russia and Ukraine, I think the largest population of Ukrainians is in Canada. So naturally, there's been Canadians going to defend Ukraine. And Russia is calling Canadians fighting in Ukraine mercenaries. Why does that terminology matter as opposed to calling them what they're being called here in Canada, foreign fighters?
Well, there's a difference between Canada or the United States or a European country officially sending troops under their own flag to help fight Russia on behalf of Ukraine. Mercenaries don't wear the flag of their country. They're going on a volunteer basis. But this is interesting because Russia is known for using mercenaries to help fight their wars overseas. The Wagner Group, for example, this sort of shadowy amalgamation of organizations that is run by an associate that's close to Vladimir Putin, has sent mercenaries to places like Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. There was a video that was released just yesterday of Wagner mercenaries doing close combat in a Ukrainian city. And so this isn't something that's just happening from the West. This is a style that has been used by Russia for a long time and continues to be used in Ukraine as well.
We've heard stories of people from Africa joining on the Russian side, but we have also heard a lot about non-Ukrainians going to defend Ukraine. Why do you think there's an interest from non-Ukrainians in foreign fighting in this war in particular? Rachel?
Well, I think that what we've seen over the last couple of months is a real hero story, right? I mean, Ukraine is a country that is much smaller than Russia, much militarily weaker, although it has put up a brave fight and has, I think, really surprised not just Russia, but the West in how it has stopped Russia from gaining territory in a way that we might thought it have been much quicker. So when we're watching this happen over the last couple of months, I think there's this sense of this David versus Goliath story, and people do want to help a country whose democracy has been thwarted and whose sovereignty has been attacked by its much larger neighbor. So it doesn't surprise me that people do feel called to help Ukraine in this war.
And Daniela, even though Russia's calling Canadians fighting in Ukraine mercenaries, Russia's used foreign fighters in other recent Russian conflicts. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, well, Russian fighters have also been sent to fight in Mali, for instance, called in by the government, it seems, and which was one of the reasons why France, who was also present, decided to actually withdraw. So it's a very contentious international issue that Russia uses these fighters in that way. And I think Ukraine is just another example on that list, and they are known for an extreme brutality. As war crimes are being investigated in Ukraine, obviously special attention will have to be paid to the question to what extent the Wagner Group and others have also been involved.
Is there any evidence that Russia is also using foreign fighters in Ukraine, or are they just using Russian soldiers, Daniela?
But that is hard to say from the outside, but there are reports which are not verified yet, to my knowledge, that they have been seen. And so the suspicion is that they have been withdrawn from other places and sent there, but this remains to be investigated.
Rachel, in 2008, Ukraine applied to become a member of NATO for the very reason of the situation we're in right now. Should Ukraine have been let into NATO when it wanted to?
Well, I think that's a topic that's being hotly debated today, but also has been debated for the last 13 years. Unfortunately, I think NATO put Ukraine and Georgia, remember, who wanted to join at the same time, NATO put them in probably the worst spot possible, which is we promised them that eventually they would join the alliance, that they would be protected by NATO's mutual defense clause, which really at the end of the day is why people want to be a part of NATO. But we didn't say when. We didn't give them a date. And so we just sort of left them hanging in limbo. And when you look at how Russia has responded to that over the last 13 years, it invaded Georgia in August of 2008. It illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, and it invaded Ukraine yet again in February of this year. And so I think that there's a lot of questions about what should have happened in 2008 and since then, if Georgia and Ukraine should have been allowed to join NATO. But at the end of the day, I think they were put in an almost impossible position.
And Daniela, you mentioned Germany kind of navigating its relationship with Russia. It's been described as painful. Why those words?
Germany had to fundamentally review its Russia policy. Over the past years, the government, despite the annexation of Crimea, still stuck to a policy which was called either Partnership for Modernization or change through trade. So the idea was that closer economic relations would actually help build a stable relationship and eventually might even open up and to some extent transform Russia. And this has obviously been proven wrong. Now, the problem is that Germany, with that policy, created a huge dependency on Russian oil and gas imports. And so today, reviewing this policy is so difficult because it cannot happen overnight that Germany says no to gas and oil imports. So a lot is happening since the beginning of the war in Ukraine to make Germany less dependent on, in particular, Russian gas imports, which have a huge share. But there's also more to that question from a German perspective. Russia is, of course, geographically very, very close to the European Union's eastern borders and to our eastern neighbors. And so the idea to have an ongoing conflictual relationship with Russia is something that worries many because of the stability of our continent. There is a saying in Germany, you cannot have peace and stability on the European continent against Russia. So obviously right now, there is no way to go back to the status quo ante. But the big question remains not only how the war and conflict in Ukraine can be settled, but also how, in particular, those countries neighboring Russia, whichever way the war settled, they have a situation where they can rely on the protection of their own sovereignty and their territory. Because, as Rachel said, Russia has been invading Europe's neighbors, 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea and Ukraine's east, and now again Ukraine with the threat to go into the Republic of Moldova and possibly other places. So this is the reality of the European continent today. And, the European security order that was built after the end of the Cold War is basically shattered. So that question with regards to Russia is a fundamental one on European security.
And Rachel, with so much of the future uncertain, to what extent does Germany have to restructure its economy because it is a NATO and EU member and has to follow suit?
Well, I think Daniela made some really excellent points, and I would agree with all of them. I mean, this is not just Germany lessening its dependence on Russian oil or gas or playing a larger role as a great power in the European Union or on the European continent. This is a complete reorientation of how Germany sees itself as a global actor, and a complete reorientation of its economy. And I don't think this is something that happens overnight. This is Germany's had a lot of pressure placed on it by European countries and the United States, and I think it's responded in a way that is laudable, and it's impressive for such a quick turnaround. And I do think that there are serious conversations happening in Berlin in terms of what this means for Germany in the long run. And I do think that we should expect some serious changes going forward, but they might take a little bit longer than people are hoping.
And Daniela, the global world order is at stake, and the world is watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely. Can you see a time when the war in Ukraine may lead to other states using force to subsume neighboring countries?
There's a clear worry that China will study the case of this war now very closely and think through its strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan. Maybe the fact that Russia wasn't able to have the victory it wanted to have in Ukraine that quickly makes it less likely that China attacks Taiwan anytime close. But if you listen to China experts, they assume that this is actually something that might happen over the next few years, which is why it is so important that those countries who stand up against the war in Ukraine, together with Ukraine, make it very, very clear that they stand for the protection of principles of the international order, and that is national sovereignty, the protection of national territory, which are fundamental principles also of the UN Charter. And so we are right now at a moment in time where the war in Ukraine and the response to the war in Ukraine have a far bigger dimension and go beyond Europe. So this is really a big challenge for those states that stand with Ukraine to make clear that they stand in not only for a country, but really for principles of a peaceful international order.
And Rachel, we've seen those images of Putin either at a big, long table with advisors seated very far away from him. Is that a metaphor for Putin's physical distance or isolation compared to the rest of the world?
Well, I do think those images are quite striking when you look at Putin and the images that are released by Russian state media. The majority of the time, it's either him in a massive room with his advisors who are far away, or him at the end of one long table where his advisors are at the opposite end. And when you contrast those to the photos that come out of Ukraine with Zelensky huddling close with his advisors, it's just a stark difference. And so I do think there is sort of a metaphor there when you look at Putin's isolation and compare it to Russia's broader isolation on the world stage. I think we also have to remember that Putin has taken COVID to the extreme. He is and has been quite isolated over the last couple of years. Reports of the requirements that his closest advisors have to go through to even get in the same room as him are pretty extreme. And so I question, and I know other people question, how that has somewhat affected his mental state over the last couple of years, and perhaps how that has played into his recent decision making.
And Daniela, we have less than a minute left. Truth has been said to be the first casualty of war, and it's hard to decipher who's winning the invasion in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of information is flowing out from Ukraine through social media, and obviously there's also a lot of Russian propaganda out there. So we have to be very careful how to digest those news, and it is very important to scrutinize and identify fake news. But at the moment, I think we see that Ukraine is standing its ground thanks to a huge mobilization also of civil society in a way that is really unexpected. And that is also why the international support also of individuals, as we discussed, to go and decide for themselves to go and help with that fight, that mobilization is so important.
Daniela, Rachel, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate your insights into this complex issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Opioid addiction and overdose deaths continue to rise in Ontario during the pandemic. That's been especially true across the north. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs. She's been looking into what the parties are promising this election to deal with the crisis, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay. Hello, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
Now, although Ontario has been experiencing an opioid crisis for more than a decade, the last few years has been especially difficult. I want to pull up a graph that illustrates the annual number of opioid-related deaths in Ontario over a 5-year period. It's a pretty dramatic rise from 2016, where deaths were under 900, to 2020 at almost 2,500. And then when we look at 2021, the past year, where the reported deaths were over 2,800. So, Charnel, let's start it off. How has the pandemic exacerbated the crisis?
So, I mean, well, just looking at that graph, in the last 5 years, almost 10,000 people have died from opioid-related causes. And I think it can be hard to imagine the impact of such a loss because, 10,000 people, that's more than the population of many small towns in Ontario that are just gone. And as you say, it's gotten worse. Over 2,800 people died from opioids last year alone. So there's been a significant jump in the number of opioid-related deaths since the pandemic began. And research from Public Health Ontario says that there's a number of reasons for this, including the increasing volatility of street drugs. So, fentanyl alone is really deadly and responsible for the majority of opioid-related deaths these days. But now we're seeing drugs that are cut with other drugs like sedatives, which can increase the risk of overdose. And a lot of times people don't even know that the drugs they're using are cut with these substances. So the unpredictability of street drugs is a factor, but during the pandemic, we also saw increased isolation, of course, reduced access to healthcare and community services that support people that use drugs. So those have had an impact as well.
Now, you cover Northern Ontario for TVO.org. I'm wondering how the opioid epidemic has sort of affected that region in particular, where services might not necessarily be readily available compared to other parts of the province like Southern Ontario.
Yeah, so I mentioned the public health report, and that tells us that during the pandemic, while the absolute number of people who died from opioid-related causes was higher in Southern Ontario at over 1,500 deaths compared to 241 deaths in Northern Ontario. But when you look at the rates, which have been adjusted for population, you see that people are dying from opioids at a higher rate in Northern Ontario. So that's roughly 28.5 opioid-related deaths per 100,000 people compared to a rate of 11 opioid-related deaths per 100,000 people in Southern Ontario. And as you say, I think this issue is really compounded by a lack of services. There's really only one withdrawal management center in Thunder Bay that turns away as many people as it accepts. And in March, temporary funding was announced from the province for 34 new treatment beds, which I'm sure will help some people and hopefully reduce some of the strain. But then you have to think about smaller communities that are ways away from urban centers. So there's certainly room for improvement in terms of access to services.
Now, you spoke to a couple of experts on their recommendations for some solutions. Curious to hear, what did they have to say?
Yeah, so I spoke with Tara Gomes, who is a researcher and scientist at Unity Health Toronto, and she's also an author of the Public Health Ontario report, who said that Ontario's opioid crisis is a public health emergency and it should be treated as such. Tara talks about this multi-pronged approach that she would like to see, which includes increasing access to treatment for people who need it. But not everyone that uses opioids is addicted to the substance, and not everyone will do well with treatment. So that's where harm reduction strategies like safe consumption sites and safer alternatives to the unregulated drug supply come in. And again, as I said, a big part of this is access. Tara says that these things need to be broadly accessible, no matter if you're in a small rural community or a large urban center.
Let's maybe take a step back and sort of look at the Ontario government's approach so far. What have we seen when it comes to tackling the opioid epidemic?
So in 2020, the previous Ford government announced that what they called the Roadmap to Wellness, which promised an investment of $3.8 billion over 10 years in mental health and addiction services. And through this initiative, investments were made in rapid access addiction medicine, also known as RAM clinics, which are kind of like walk-in clinics where people can go to access treatment. As well, there's been more funding for addiction and treatment with withdrawal beds, such as the ones in Thunder Bay that I mentioned. And you may remember back in 2018, the Ford government completed a review of supervised consumption sites, and this review found them to be effective in reducing opioid-related illness and death, like much of the research suggests. And so at that time, the government announced that they would provide $31 million in funding to a maximum of 21 sites, essentially capping the number of supervised consumption sites, which means now, 4 years and thousands of opioid-related deaths later, there's still only 21 supervised injection sites in Ontario that are accessible to the public, the vast majority of which are in Southern Ontario.
As you know, we are in the middle of an election campaign, and I am curious to know what the parties are planning, the four major political parties are planning to address the opioid crisis. Let's start with the Conservatives. Have they made any sort of promises in their new platform or any other promises going forward?
Right. So this is actually a tough one for me to answer because the Tories did not respond to multiple requests for comment. But if we look at the new Ontario budget, which the Tories say they will pass if they're reelected, they say that they will make an additional investment of $208 million to build mental health capacity in a range of areas, including addiction services, supportive housing, mental health, and Indigenous mental health and addictions.
All right. How about the NDP? What do they have to say?
So a spokesperson for the NDP says that if elected, they will declare the opioid crisis a public health emergency and invest in addiction rehabilitation, detox centers, and harm reduction strategies. The NDP say they will remove the cap on supervised injection sites, fast track approval for these sites in the north in particular, and work to ensure safer alternatives to the unregulated drug supply.
And
as well, the NDP say they will also work with the federal government to decriminalize personal drug use and reduce stigma of drug addiction.
And let's turn our attention to the Liberals. Is there anything that sticks out from their promise when it comes to addressing the opioid crisis?
Yeah, so a spokesperson for the Liberal Party says that they will also lift the cap on safe consumption sites and approve applications for underserved communities. If elected, the Liberals would reconvene the opioid emergency task force and make investments to, quote, prevent, intervene, and treat opioid addiction and overdoses by providing things like naloxone kits, fentanyl test strips, and other harm reduction supplies to pharmacies, community spaces, and first responders.
And to round out the four, finally, what plans do the Greens have?
So the Green Party says that if elected, they would also declare the opioid crisis a public health emergency. And their plan to tackle this issue includes decriminalizing drug use, establishing a 24/7 province-wide mental health crisis response line, and creating crisis response teams which would respond to overdoses. The Greens plan also includes increasing the number of treatment beds, expanding harm reduction programs, including safe supply, as well as other initiatives around supportive housing and healthcare access. And finally, the Green Party says that they would also reboot the Ontario Emergency Opioid Task Force in order to kind of further develop a strategy to address the opioid crisis.
Charnel, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate story, but an important one. So thank you so much for sharing your insights on this one.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week: assess the party's campaign advertising strategies, consider their healthcare platforms, and asked why some people simply don't get infected with COVID-19. The agenda's week in review begins with opening day of Ontario's 43rd general election.
Very simply, what's this election about?
I think it's a little bit too early to answer that question. As you know, we have about 4 weeks to the election day, and every week in an election in the political realm is a lifetime. And we could be coming back here talking about completely different things next week. So as it stands right now, I think we're looking at the path to prosperity. With the rise of inflation, I think people are mostly looking at pocketbook issues and issues around cost of living, cost of housing, etc.
Okay, Kim Wright, in your view, what's this election about?
To me, it really is about where you want to take this province. And one of the things that we saw during the pandemic so clearly is what is the role of government? What are the institutions that Ontarians really do count on, not in some sort of theoretical, poli-sci class, but when we start to talk about how we build a community, how do we make sure that our long-term care facilities are actually taking care of our loved ones? How do we make sure our public health institutions are not only talking to one another, but are demonstrably keeping people safe? Those are all part of the role of government. So what you have to have is a government that is interested in fixing the problems, not just talking about them. But how do you actually move forward? How do you connect with people? And that's what you're going to see over the course of the next 28 days through all of the campaigns, but certainly that's the focus of Andrea Horwath and the New Democrats.
Tim Murphy, what's this election about?
Well, I think it's ultimately a referendum on the government and whether, frankly, you think the healthcare system is better than it was 4 years ago, whether you think the education system is better than it was 4 years ago, whether the issues of affordability, of the costs of groceries, of housing, of just living every day is more easy to afford than it was 4 years ago, and whether those things were handled well over the course of the last 4 years. And then once you kind of come to the answer to that question, the question is who's best positioned to then, assuming you're deciding to change, can best fix some of those problems. And Steve Del Duca is the answer to that question.
That's the first time I've ever heard him called Steve Del Duca. Are you breaking news here today, Tim?
Yeah. I break news whenever I've just known him for so long. I apologize. I know it's the official frame. But just so we're clear, Steve, we only have people who look like Steve comment on television as well.
Follicularly challenged, I think, is the way you want to put that. Okay, I get you. Sean Yeo, come on in here and tell us what this election's about.
I think the people of Ontario have a very important and legitimate question to ask: how are we going to be taken care of over the next 4 years, and how can we take care of each other? And I certainly agree that a huge part of that is looking at the record of each party and asking how well did they do in the last 4 years.
Sabrina, your view.
Well, I think certainly what the electorate are telling pollsters is that it's affordability, and what we're hearing from the parties, it's kind of like, what exactly does affordability mean to you? That can be everything from being able to afford a down payment on your first home to, as the Liberals have proposed, getting a break on your grocery bill, with scrapping the HST from prepared foods up to $20. So I think it's cost of living is if I had to pick one issue, I would go with that one.
Sabrina, I am not going to ask you whether you think the government deserves to be reelected or anything like that, because that's probably not fair to put you in that position. But let me twist the question a bit this way for you. The most significant commitment that Doug Ford made 4 years ago while campaigning for office that he kept, what do you think it is?
Well, I think it kind of depends on your vantage point on this front, because certainly a lot of these, promise made, promise kept, that line that we keep hearing from the Conservatives can be spun a little bit. For instance, I'm thinking of this gas tax cut that was a little late in coming. It's temporary. We need to give the Ford government a second mandate in order to see, 5.7 cents shaved off for 6 months only. There's, a tax cut for folks earning up to $50,000 when we know, 4 years ago, they promised a 20% income tax cut for middle income earners. And I would say that it sort of depends on your spin of that.
The Conservatives have made clear that what they're going to do is cheerlead their folks right to the polls. Their ads are very much like something right out of a Nickelback video. There's the fist pumping, anthemic music. They might as well have called it "Get Her Done" instead of "Get It Done." It's a very folksy approach to things. The NDP, they have had a few kicks at this with their current leader. And so their first order of business appears to be taking on the record of the government, attacking Stephen Del Duca, trying to establish their own leader as the credible choice. You have no other alternatives. Let's go with the credible one this time. I think that's very much what they're trying to go for. And interestingly, I was surprised when they did test some ads out last fall, and it'll be interesting to see if they reprise this theme during the campaign. It was interesting that they recycled a phrase from the 2011 federal Conservative campaign, pasting Doug Ford and Stephen Del Duca with this "he didn't come back for you" business that was used against Michael Ignatieff by the Conservatives. It'll be interesting to see if the NDP continues that theme about, they're not here for you, they're here for power, they're here for other things. In terms of the Liberals, there's no question they're going to be attacking the Ford government's record, but they're also going to be introducing people to Stephen Del Duca, and that's very clear from the very first ad they dropped. They are concerned, and they should be, that people don't know who Stephen Del Duca is, what he stands for, which makes him a bit of a blank slate for the other parties to write their story on. And so they're working really hard early to try and create a narrative about Stephen Del Duca that they think will be appealing and positive. And as for the Greens, the Green Party obviously has a big hill to climb, but they're very much pushing the credibility buttons. They're talking about, in their bits, in their 30-second pieces, they're talking about having a real plan for, a real plan for housing, a real plan for mental health, a real plan for climate change. So they're trying to push, again, that credibility button and show that they're about business, they're not about pomp and circumstance.
Laura, I'll get your take as well on that. Was there anything that stood out, whether from Tim's response there as well, but from the major parties as well?
The one thing I'm really noticing is the way the Conservatives are kind of going after the previous Liberal governments. And I think that's an interesting one to consider. I mean, the Liberals aren't the opposition right now, right? They are definitely, I'd say, weaker electorally than the NDP, although they're fighting hard against that. And the PCs are going back in time saying, remember, you didn't like that before, and we've cleaned up that mess. And so I think that's an interesting bit of positioning. It says a little bit about what the PCs think is their real opposition this time around. I mean, I think, obviously Tim gave a great rundown of the different campaigns, so I don't need to reiterate those. But what I'm really kind of watching is the way that the NDP is trying to position itself as like, here's the alternative to what you have, right? And then the Liberals are really hard trying to, I guess, come back up. So certainly, yes, introducing their leader, that's definitely a big thing. But it's hard sometimes to differentiate between the Liberals and the NDP in a lot of the things that they promise and a lot of the things that they say. And so, it's the starker contrast, I think, that comes between the PCs and the NDP, and that's what they're trying to kind of go forward on, right? Like, if not that, then us, and we're the ones who've been here. So it'll be interesting to watch whether these messages change and whether the PCs actually, turn and start to target the NDP a little bit more.
As much as we're talking about the message, I think a big part about advertising is the dollars as well. And Tim, when we talk about the advertisement dollars and getting the message out there, which party typically has the deeper pockets?
Well, typically the incumbent party does, and that's certainly true this time. The Conservatives have been fundraising like gangbusters even through the pandemic. But interestingly, this time the NDP has the biggest budget it's ever had. It has more money at the moment than the Liberals currently do. So it will put them in a really interesting position in this campaign to be able to spend a lot more than they're used to being able to spend on an ad buy.
Now, Laura, when it's election time, there's lots of rules. And that's the same thing when it comes to advertising as well. How do political advertising rules dictate what parties can and can't do, and sort of a timeline as well? Because these rules sort of date back well into 2021 or the later half of the year as well.
Well, the biggest thing is what happens now, right? Basically today, with the start of the campaign, that's when the real rules come into play.
Let me just, because you all have a different lens upon which you see the healthcare system, get you from your vantage point to tell us off the top here what you think the biggest problem the pandemic has caused in our healthcare system from your vantage point. Dr. Zacharias, why don't you go first?
Absolutely. And thank you for the congratulations, Steve. It's an honor, actually, to represent Ontario's 43,000 physicians. And indeed, I start my term today. But the backlog and really, the pandemic has exposed 21 million patient care procedures that have been waylaid during the crisis of COVID. And we recently had an opportunity to poll all of Ontarians, and they said this is the #1 priority. It's exposed that we're behind, and also that we're exhausted. Teams of healthcare providers are indeed exhausted. It's been stressful, the pandemic, and that's really where we're at.
Dr. Danielle Martin, we had you on this program not too long ago talking about that very thing, but given a new opportunity to speak about this, what would you say is the biggest problem right now today?
My biggest concern right now, Steve, is the number of people who've become disconnected or loosely connected to their family doctor or primary care team, because we can't get people back in for the canceled procedures or the ultrasound, or back up to date on their screening, or back on track with their diabetes care, or any of the things that have been pushed off and have fallen through the cracks in the pandemic if people aren't closely connected to primary care. So I think that is the most important task ahead of us.
All right, Dr. Banerjee, what say you?
I'd say it's a lack of trust between physicians, nurses, and other front care providers, health care providers, with the government. And the government has really basically ignored the advice of physicians, infectious disease specialists, public health specialists. And for example, throughout the pandemic, they refused to have sick days for people that were sick and people we knew had COVID, and they had to go back to work because they had no choice. And recently, for example, despite a lot of us saying that it's not safe, they removed the mask mandate for children, young children in schools where most of them are unvaccinated. So that's part of it. I think there's a huge mental health crisis right now, and there's not a lot of resources and lot of wait times. The other thing is that the Ontario government has ignored First Nations, and they've been left to fight COVID basically on their own. You know, when Ford said, you know, we need masks in every school, get HEPA filters, not one First Nation school got HEPA filters and the masks. And so recently when First Nations communities in the north were on fire, and that's not too long ago, it's just in the past month, we've been coming down from COVID. They cut the funding to the nomadic health units through Orange, where, you know, these units are supposed to go in and give support to the communities. So I think there's been, all of this points to the lack of trust.
All right, lots to follow up there, which we shall do over the course of our discussion. Catherine Hoy, how about from your vantage point?
I'd first like to thank you very much for the invite. It's such an honor. But listening to the other three speakers, it all comes down to, though, we cannot provide service because of the staffing crisis. The pandemic has led to a staffing crisis that we have never seen before. And the Ontario Nurses Association has been telling the government this for years. I would estimate we're at 30,000 nurses short, plus healthcare professionals. And I would have thought that the government would have listened to the SARS report, where it said your most important resources are your staffing. And they did not listen to that. Instead, staffing is the largest line item on a budget. So that is where they wanted to save the dollars. So we cannot provide the surgeries. We cannot help the family physicians. We cannot help schools. Everywhere that healthcare touches, because we do not have the staff. And the people of Ontario, they really need to listen. They really need to look at the platforms this election, because healthcare is number one.
Are there any other certain demographic groups that are more likely to be, quote unquote, COVID resistant?
So that's a great question. And just to go back to the fact that I think we have a lot to learn from our different cohorts, as Dawn just mentioned, particularly the elderly. And what we've come to realize, at least for COVID, is if we remember back to the first waves, the demographic cohort that was essentially slaughtered with the first waves in COVID were the elderly, and particularly the elderly male. At the time, our understanding was essentially rudimentary, if not speculative, that maybe they had an old immune system or something to that effect. But we and others have collaborated to identify that, in fact, the elderly, but particularly elderly male, have what we call autoantibodies that actually neutralize their response to a molecule of the immune system called type 1 interferon. And as a result, that is at least a one contributing factor to why they get life-threatening disease. On the other hand, what you're asking is, why are there some other people who are resistant? And in fact, we have an even rarer cohort of people who have actually suffered and survived through two pandemics, both the pandemic flu of 1918 and, of course, the current pandemic. So that puts them at a very, rare cohort of 104 or so and older. So we're trying to understand the molecular and perhaps the genetic reasons for why some of these people tend to be what we call resistant or resilient, if you will. But we're still early in that process.
Okay, let's talk about research. Donald and Dawn, you both are working on and leading some research. And I want to start with Donald. You're part of an international study looking into why people exposed to COVID haven't gone sick. How would you describe this project and sort of the goals there and where you're at right now?
Well, so this consortium is called the COVID Human Genetics Effort. It's led by doctors Jean-Laurent Casanova out of the Rockefeller and Helen Sue at the NIH, and we're the Canadian, major site that's collaborating with this group. In this group, we've actually identified that for the severe cases, we've identified the autoantibodies that I just mentioned, and in a small cohort of people, also they have genetic mutations that impair their ability to fight off the virus, and then that's why they get the severe disease. And so now we're trying to understand the resistance component, as we were talking about with our other guests just a few minutes ago. And so what we're trying to do there is recruit, and we're actually recruiting from long-term care facilities across the country, also community dwelling people who tell us, we have proof that we were exposed to people who were infected. Many of them are actually not properly vaccinated or at all vaccinated, and so we're contributing to that. And we have in this collaboration, we have about 1,000 people or so that have gone through the various steps that we've defined to make sure that they really are, have never been infected. They really are what we call COVID naive. And now we're in the process of analyzing the genomic data.
I want to pick COVID naive. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's the term that we use, and we don't mean that in any sort of derogatory term. We just mean that their immune system has not effectively seen the virus through immunological tests that we run on their blood samples.
And what exact tests are those? And those would be very different from the tests that the sort of the public would have seen so far, correct?
Yeah, so first of all, we're physicians, right? So as physicians, we speak to the patients and we get a history from them. When we find out, okay, well, tell us about the person in your entourage or your loved one or your family member who was infected. How sick were they? How exposed were you to them? So we get all that kind of what we call clinical information. And then we also go for what we call their microbiological information. We ask them to provide us the results of their tests, either PCR tests or rapid antigen tests that demonstrate that, in fact, they were tested and consistently negative negative. And then after that, we take their blood and we look for antibodies that either are related to the virus or to the vaccine or both or to neither. And we also look at their cells and look to see if their cells can recognize COVID. And if, of course, they can't recognize COVID, that would also help us support the idea that their body really has not been infected with COVID before.
All right, Dawn, long-term care homes have been the epicenter of the pandemic across this country. You're doing something similar in terms of looking at the research there. What are you looking for exactly?
One of the things we're investigating is the relative role of the different arms of the immune system. We've all heard about antibodies, especially in the context of vaccination, and in general, having high levels of antibody tend to be more protective than having low levels of antibodies. But there's a second arm of the immune system, and that's the cellular arm of the immune system. And what's fascinating about the aging immune system is it comes with decades of immune experience. We actually have circulating relatives of SARS-CoV-2 called the seasonal coronaviruses, and the infection rates for those viruses are very, very high in long-term care. So one of our hypotheses, based on studies that have been done in other parts of the world, is that some of these people who are resistant may be using that cellular arm of the immune response and may be drawing upon some of that immune memory of those related viruses to help deal with an infection when they see the SARS-CoV-2. And so I think as we're sort of refining, and my colleague Dr. Miller, I'm sure will expand on this, but as we're refining our understanding of what can protect us, we realize that capturing those cellular immune responses may be incredibly important in dealing with variants of concern and with future variants, because there does seem to be a little bit more familiarity between the different types of virus that allows people to pull up those immune responses and deal with those future infections.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, May 6, 2022. How do the parties intend to deal with a widening range of economic challenges? We'll examine that on Monday. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve, we'll see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.